The night was so still that Antony Coulthard could hear his own pulse. It thudded in his ears, loud and insistent, as he crouched at the edge of the wire and waited for the searchlight to swing away. The light passed, slowly, lazily, as if the guards themselves were half asleep, bored by a camp that had never given them reason to be afraid. When the beam disappeared behind the watchtower, Coulthard moved. The final strand of wire came free in his hands. For a moment, he did nothing. He stayed where he was, half inside the camp and half outside it, as if the world itself were split down the middle. On one side were the barracks, the roll calls, the shouted German orders, the endless hunger. On the other was darkness, unknown, dangerous, but open. He slipped through. The ground beyond the fence felt different beneath his boots. It was firmer, untouched by the constant trampling of prisoners. He took 3 careful steps, then another, then stopped again, listening. No alarm, no whistle, no gunshot. Antony Coulthard had escaped. He did not smile, he did not celebrate. He had learned long ago that optimism was a luxury that got men killed. Instead, he did what training and instinct demanded. He oriented himself, fixed the direction in his mind, and began to move away from the camp at a steady, disciplined pace. Behind him, the barbed wire stood silent. And behind that wire, in Barrack 7, Sergeant Fred Foster lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Fred Foster had known Coulthard was going to try. He had known because Antony had not said goodbye. In the camp, farewells were dangerous things. They lingered in the air. They made men hesitate. And hesitation, more than guards or dogs or bullets, was what killed escapees. So Coulthard had simply nodded once, earlier that evening, when the others were distracted by a thin soup that tasted of nothing at all. One nod. That was it. Now Fred lay still on his bunk, one hand pressed against his ribs where the pain never quite faded. He had been injured during capture. Nothing dramatic, no heroic wound, but the kind of damage that never healed properly in a place like this. Too little food, too much cold, too much work. The body gave up trying. He listened to the sounds of the camp. A man coughing somewhere down the row, boots crunching outside as a guard passed, the creak of timber in the wind. He counted time by the rhythm of it, wondering how far Antony might be by now. If he had made it. Fred turned his face to the wall. He had already decided what would happen next. If Coulthard escaped, truly escaped, Fred would not try again. Not on his own. Not with his body in the state it was in. He would survive the camp if he could. If not, then at least one of them would have lived. That was the bargain. Unspoken, but understood. Coulthard moved through the countryside like a ghost. He avoided roads, avoided farmhouses, avoided anything that suggested human presence. He drank from ditches, ate what little he had managed to hide away over weeks of preparation, and rested only when his legs threatened to fail beneath him. Dawn crept up slowly, turning the horizon from black to gray to pale silver. With daylight came danger. By mid-morning, he was deep enough into the woods to risk stopping. He wedged himself between 2 fallen trees, pulled his coat tight, and closed his eyes. Sleep came instantly, heavy and dreamless. When he woke again, the sun was high, and with it came the truth he had been avoiding. He was free, not completely safe. No escaped prisoner ever was, but free enough that survival was now possible. If he kept moving, if he stayed disciplined, he could reach friendly territory. He could reach people who would help him. He could go home. The thought landed heavily. Home. Faces appeared in his mind. Family he had not seen in years. Streets he had walked as a younger man. A life that belonged to another version of himself. He had dreamed of this moment so often in the camp that it almost felt rehearsed. And yet, alongside those images, another face intruded. Fred, lying awake in Barrack 7, listening to boots outside, waiting for a morning roll call that would last hours in the cold. Coulthard pushed himself to his feet, irritated at the thought, as if it were an obstacle to be overcome rather than a memory. This was how the mind betrayed you, he told himself. It dragged you backward when all that mattered was forward motion. He set off again. By the second night, he knew the search would be underway. Escapes were rare, but not unheard of. When they happened, the response was swift and brutal. Roadblocks, patrols, questioned civilians, dogs. Coulthard saw evidence of it everywhere. Fresh tire tracks on dirt roads, smoke from fires that hadn't been there the day before. The sudden absence of people from villages that now felt shuttered and hostile. He avoided them all. His world narrowed to the next tree, the next hill, the next patch of cover. He stopped thinking in sentences and began thinking in needs. Water, shelter, direction. He crossed a railway line at dusk, waited a full hour to be certain it wasn't watched, then moved on. Somewhere to the west, always west, safety waited. He told himself again that Fred would understand. Fred was a soldier. He knew the rules. Escapees did not turn back. They did not compromise their own survival for sentiment. One man free was better than two captured. These were facts. Solid. Unarguable. They did nothing to ease the pressure building in Coulthard's chest. On the third day, he reached a farmhouse. He had tried to avoid it, skirting the edge of the fields, but hunger made him careless. The smell of bread carried on the wind, warm and unmistakable. He waited for hours, watching, until he was certain the place was empty. Then he approached cautiously and slipped inside. He found food, real food, enough to last him days if he rationed it carefully. As he ate, seated on the floor with his back against the wall, his hands began to shake. It was the first time since the escape that his body had allowed itself to react. The tension poured out of him all at once, leaving exhaustion in its wake. He leaned his head back and closed his eyes, chewing slowly. That was when he heard the voices. German. They were not inside the house, but close enough that he could make out words. 2 men, maybe 3. Casual, unhurried. A patrol. Coulthard moved without thinking, extinguishing the small flame he had lit, pressing himself into the shadows as boots approached the door. The handle rattled once, then again. The door opened. The men did not search thoroughly. They took water, talked, laughed at something Coulthard could not hear clearly. One of them mentioned the escaped prisoner, dismissively, as if the idea of catching him was inevitable. Only a matter of time, one said. They left as casually as they had arrived. When the door closed, Coulthard remained still for a long time. The farmhouse, which had seemed like salvation moments earlier, now felt like a warning. It was working. The net was tightening, and Fred was still inside it. That night, Coulthard did not sleep. He lay in the woods, staring up through branches at a sky crowded with stars, and replayed the last weeks in the camp. The whispered conversations, the planning, the careful hoarding of scraps and tools. Fred's cough worse lately, the way he had struggled during work details, trying not to be noticed. He remembered a conversation they had shared months earlier, during a rare moment when the guards were distracted and the camp felt almost quiet. "If one of us gets out," Fred had said, staring straight ahead, "the other stays alive. That's the deal." Coulthard had nodded. It had seemed obvious at the time. Now the words felt different. Alive did not mean safe. Alive did not mean long. He rolled onto his side and clenched his fists, angry, at himself, at Fred, at a war that demanded choices like this from men who had no right to be asked. By dawn, the decision had not yet formed fully in his mind, but his feet knew the way. When he began to move again, It was not west. It was back the way he had come. The first step was the hardest. It felt like stepping off solid ground into empty air. Every instinct screamed at him to stop, to turn around, to resume the path toward freedom. He ignored it and kept walking. By noon, he was deep back into occupied territory. By evening, the signs of the search were everywhere. He moved faster now, urgency replacing caution. He was no longer escaping. He was infiltrating. Every shadow could hide a patrol. Every sound could mean capture. The consequences of being caught a second time were not abstract to him. He knew the rules. Repeat escapees were not treated kindly. Still, he went on. He crossed the railway again, this time in full darkness, heart pounding. He bypassed the farmhouse without slowing. He drank from the same ditch as before, tasted the same muddy water, and pushed his body harder than it wanted to go. He did not allow himself to imagine success. He allowed himself only one thought. Fred must not die alone. When the camp finally came into view again, days later, Coulthard stopped at the edge of the woods. The watchtowers stood exactly where they had always stood. The light swept the same familiar arcs. The wire glinted faintly in the moonlight, indifferent to the drama unfolding around it. From here, the camp looked small, contained, a trap. Coulthard crouched low, studying patterns, memorizing movements, forcing himself to slow down. Recklessness would doom them both. If he was going back in, it had to be done properly. He waited, and as he waited, he understood fully what he had done. He had given up his escape. He had traded freedom for a chance. No guarantee, no certainty, at saving one man. The knowledge settled over him calmly. There was no regret. At 1:15 a.m., Antony Coulthard began moving toward the wire again. This time, there was no illusion of escape. Every calculation in his head ran in reverse. Instead of asking how to get out unseen, he asked how to get back in without being noticed long enough to reach Barrack 7. The difference mattered. The margin for error was smaller. The punishment for failure was absolute. He timed the patrols carefully. The guards moved in habits, not strategies. Men grew lazy when nothing ever happened. Coulthard had learned this the hard way over years of captivity, and now he used it. When the light swung away, he crossed the open ground in a low sprint, stopped, waited, then moved again. The wire was intact. That alone nearly broke him. For a long moment he crouched there, fingers resting against the cold metal, listening to his own breathing. The opening he had made days earlier had been repaired. Fresh wire, new knots, a quiet acknowledgement that the Germans expected him, or someone like him, to try again. Coulthard did not curse. He did not hesitate. He began to work. It took longer this time. His hands cramped, and the fear of sound pressed in on him from all sides. Several times he froze as footsteps passed nearby, his body locked into stillness so complete it felt unnatural. When the wire finally parted enough for him to squeeze through, his arms were trembling with exhaustion. He slipped back into the camp he had already escaped. The air inside felt heavier, as if the place itself resented his return. Barrack 7 lay exactly where he remembered it, a dim shape against the darker night, its windows blacked out, its walls soaked with the presence of too many men forced too close together. Coulthard moved along the outer edge, counting silently, orienting himself by memory rather than sight. He reached the door. Inside, the barrack smelled of sweat, damp wood, and sickness. The sound of breathing filled the space, uneven and layered. Men slept in various states of unrest, some murmuring, some coughing, some staring at nothing in the dark. Coulthard moved between bunks like a shadow. He found Fred where he expected him to be, on the lower bunk near the wall. Fred's eyes were open. For a heartbeat, neither man moved. Then Fred's hand shot out, gripping Coulthard's sleeve with surprising strength. "You idiot," Fred whispered. Coulthard let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Quiet." Fred stared at him, disbelief warring with something else. Anger, relief, fear, all tangled together. "You were out," he said. "You were gone." "Not far enough," Coulthard replied. Fred shook his head slowly. "You weren't supposed to come back." "I know." They did not speak for several seconds after that. There was nothing else to say. The decision had already been made. Words would only cheapen it. Coulthard crouched beside the bunk. Up close, Fred looked worse than he remembered. Thinner. His skin had taken on a grayish cast that no amount of willpower could disguise. "We move tonight," Coulthard said quietly. Fred's grip tightened. "I can't." "You can." Fred swallowed. "Tony, listen to me," Coulthard said, keeping his voice low but firm. "I got out once. I can do it again. But I won't leave you here." Fred closed his eyes briefly, as if bracing himself against the truth of it. "All right," he said. They waited until the camp settled into its deepest quiet. Getting Fred out of the barrack was the first test. He moved stiffly, pain evident in every step, but he did not complain. Coulthard supported him when needed, careful to distribute the weight, so it looked like nothing more than two men steadying each other in the dark. The wire loomed ahead. Coulthard went first, easing the opening wider, holding it steady as Fred followed. Fred's breathing grew shallow as he squeezed through, his face pale in the faint light. For a moment, Coulthard thought he might faint right there, tangled in the wire. But Fred made it. They were outside together. For one brief, impossible moment, Coulthard allowed himself to imagine that it might actually work. Then the searchlight snapped on. It caught them mid-step, freezing them in white glare. A shout followed immediately, sharp and unmistakable. Coulthard reacted on instinct, pulling Fred forward, trying to drag him into the darkness beyond the beam. It was too late. Boots thundered. Orders barked. Rifles were raised. Coulthard felt the impact before he heard the sound, a blunt force that drove the air from his lungs and sent him sprawling. Fred went down beside him, gasping, clutching his side. Hands grabbed them roughly, hauling them to their feet. A rifle butt struck Coulthard across the shoulder, hard enough to make his vision blur. He did not cry out. Fred sagged against him. "Run," Fred whispered hoarsely. Coulthard tightened his grip instead. They were separated moments later, dragged apart by guards who had no interest in their bond or their intentions. Coulthard caught one last glimpse of Fred being hauled upright, still conscious, eyes locked onto his. There was no panic in them, only apology. Coulthard's second imprisonment was nothing like the first. There were no explanations, no questions, no pretense of procedure. He was taken somewhere deeper inside the camp, somewhere colder, where light seemed reluctant to enter. Time lost its meaning almost immediately. He was beaten, but not randomly. This was not anger. It was instruction. You do not try again. Between blows, between stretches of darkness, he thought of Fred. He clung to the image of him being returned to the barrack, alive, injured, punished, but alive. That thought anchored him when everything else slipped away. Days passed, or nights, or both. When Coulthard was finally brought before an officer, the man did not raise his voice. "You escaped once," the officer said, consulting a file. "You returned. Why?" Coulthard said nothing. The officer looked up. "You could have lived." Coulthard met his gaze. So could he. The officer closed the file. That was the end of the conversation. Fred Foster survived. He survived the punishment that followed the failed escape. He survived the winter that came after. He survived the camp long enough for liberation to arrive, ragged and unbelievable, carried on the backs of exhausted Allied soldiers who could barely comprehend what they were seeing. Fred never saw Antony Coulthard again. He learned of his fate indirectly, through fragments and rumors that filtered through the camp like smoke. A repeat escapee, severe punishment, no return. For a long time, Fred refused to accept it. He told himself that Tony was somewhere else, moved to another camp, another prison, another corner of the war's vast machinery. It was easier to believe in uncertainty than in sacrifice. But as months passed, the truth settled in. Coulthard had known what would happen. He had gone back anyway. After the war, Fred Foster spoke rarely of captivity. When he did, he avoided grand statements and sweeping judgments. He spoke instead of small things: the cold, the hunger, the way men learned to communicate with looks and gestures when words were dangerous. And sometimes, when pressed, he spoke of Antony Coulthard. He told the story plainly. No embellishment. No attempt to frame it as heroism. Just facts. Tony escaped. Tony came back. Tony did not leave him behind. When asked why Coulthard had done it, Fred never offered an answer. He did not say loyalty. He did not say bravery. He did not say sacrifice. He said only, "He was my friend." Years later, when the war had become history and the camps had become places people visited rather than feared, Fred returned to the region once. He did not go inside the camp. He stood at a distance, looking at the outline of the wire, the towers, the ground where everything had narrowed to a single decision. He did not stay long. Some choices, he knew, did not belong to the living forever. They belonged to the moment they were made, and to the people who made them. Antony Coulthard's choice had not changed the course of the war. It had not altered strategy or shifted borders. It had not saved thousands. It had saved one man, and it had cost him everything.